So here's a quick lecture on Baroque art. And why this is important is because Baroque art is one of the things that AP loves to put into the work that in the test because it spans such a large kind of group of concepts. It it links the Renaissance and the um, Reformation, while at the same time sets stage for the next part, which is absolutism and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Um, we're going to see by who buys the art how this fits into the whole concept of each of these time periods. So Baroque art is very dynamic. It gives you the emotion. Emotion isn't something like in romantic art. It evokes something in you as the patron, as the person looking at the art. But in the case of Baroque art is where the artist is literally giving you the their emotion. They're telling you this is how they feel. Baroque art tends to be um, have a lot of energy to it. There's a lot of expression to it. They typically have a single light source. There's a focused piece of light that comes into it. Um, and there is a lot more portraits. They're very realistic, refined style. So now, when we're talking about the Catholic countries, this is what we're talking: Italy, Flanders, the Flemish, um, Spain, and France to a degree. But think about the Italians. There's a reason why the Italian Baroque is important. Is it fits into what we're calling the Counter Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, how the Catholic Church is going to address the problems of the Catholic of the time period, and that those ideas that were created by Lutheran Reformation. So Baroque art, why it's important is that it when people left the Catholic Church and they went to Protestantism, they didn't see that how to get people back. How do you bring people back? Well, one of the things is when they went to these Protestant churches, there wasn't the same artistic ideas. They didn't feel God was there. And so the Catholic Church, by putting in the paintings, the statues, things like that, it invokes this idea that God is present. And it makes people want to come back to the Catholic Church. It's like we said in class, there's a difference between going to one of our Friday night football games and going to a professional football game at like Lambeau Field. It's this whole experience that you're going for. And so the Catholic Church, by investing in art and improving the Vatican, was a way of invoking the idea that God is present, and it pulls people back into the Catholic Church. And so it was a recruitment tool because the Catholic Church hadn't had to recruit before. And especially when you're coming away from these Puritan churches, they're very purified, whitewashed walls, no painting, no stained glass windows. It was easy to see how the art would pull people back in. A couple of the artists we're talking about: Caravaggio, very secularized religious art. Here's some examples of it. Seeing the single light source, as you can see on the one side of the body. Bacchus, one of his paintings. Here's the light source of Paul. You can see where the light is coming from above. It's the idea of divine inspiration of God in the painting. Crucifixion of St. Peter. The decapitation of John the Baptist. Still, you can see that single light source. See how there's very much an emotion. And you can see the patron is clearly the church. Inspiration of St. Matthew. Now, this is the one we're going to talk about. Is when we get here, we talk about the female Caravaggio. Caravaggio is one of the painters we're looking at here that working directly for the Catholic Church. This is his daughter. There's an example of point of view. Is that when you compare, because she was a victim of sexual assault, her paintings has that very much a rage to it that and many of her paintings have this when it deals with men in the painting, is that it's very much a sense of aggression towards them because of what happened to her, and that she felt like justice wasn't received. So this is a good example of point of view when you compare her father's painting and her painting, is that as a survivor of sexual assault who didn't get a chance because women were seen as property in many cases, he paid a fine, and she actually had to be tortured to find out that she was telling the truth. And this unrequited concept of justice is what feeds into her painting and gives you that emotional sense. And it's definitely an example of how AP would use this for point of view. Um, Mary Magdalene, another one. We talked about the sacrifice of Isaac. Bernini, the sculptor. And the thing about sculptures during this period of Baroque is that the statues have motion. So here they're just standing here like they're these are Michelangelo and Donatello's David, same subject. They look like they're standing on at the end of a Gap ad. Okay, but this one, this David by Bernini, has motion to it. It's movement or the texturization of skin. So there's movement in the stone. Another one here, Bernini in the Sistine Chapel. You can see the idea of the flowing robes, the motion. He also did the Piazza at St. Peter's. That's this area here, which then creates this concept of God around you. God surrounds you, and it becomes part of the experience to pull people back into the Catholic Church. So, like we said, this is a reaction to the Reformation. This is the Catholic way of pulling people back in the church, as Lutherans, Protestant, Puritans, Methodists, they're coming later, all of them start purifying the church and taking out the art and the statues, especially in the case of the Puritans. This was their way of bringing them back. And this is Baroque. Now, French Baroque, we're going to see, and this is the thing we're going to see, is that with Louis XIV, it's not about God and bringing God's presence in, is that the Catholic Church in Italy, they're doing it for the betterment of the church, right? Here, we're seeing the beginning of absolutism, that Louis XIV and other monarchs, all the way up into even England with Charles I, are using the Baroque art, the ornateness, the grandeur of it, to show how great they are. So this is part of absolutism also. So it's part of the Counter-Reformation, but it also is part of absolutism. And look at me. Look how magnificent I am. And Baroque art does that. And we see that here's some of the French painter Latour, seeing the single light source is the candle. They're also seeing a hint of the scientific revolution. These people had to understand refractory light. They understand the concepts of how light works. And so you're seeing the beginning of science and art increasing even more than what we saw in the Renaissance. And Poussin, portraits. The Spanish Baroque, again, accenting the power both of the Catholic Church and the idea of the absolute monarchs, in that he paints for the court, Vasquez does. Here you see him painting the royal, the maids of honor, the handmaids of the court. The Flemish Baroque is where you see Rubens. Again, a lot of this kind of in between both religious and the beginnings of what we saw in absolutism, in that Rubens painting Queen Maria de Medici in this spectacular opulency and everything. So we're seeing this kind of like linking of the two, of both religion, but also this idea of feeding into the grandeur of the absolute monarchs. That we talked about this one in class, the Rubens again. And this is also the idea that it feeds into the wealthy, because who's going to buy these are the wealthy patrons, the wealthy merchants of that, who now have the ability to go to places like North Africa and places like that, as sailing has become more easier and become safer because of technology. This then allows them to go to these places and talk about the exoticness of them. And hence, but remember, Rubens knows about these things, but he's never seen a hippo, hence this, or you never seen a crocodile, hence whatever's happening down here. Van Dyck is a portrait painter. Again, this feeds into those absolute monarchs. Charles I will later be beheaded, but he sees himself as an absolute monarch. And before the English Civil War, that he had absolute power. Well, and Van Dyck's paintings that create this grandeur of the absolute monarchs, that's what this is. In Holland and England also, we're going to see the beginning of the wealthy merchants. So we're going to see landscapes, we're going to see more portraits, we're going to see more common everyday lives. mainly because the merchants are the wealthy people buying these things. So it's the artists were basically had to paint what the people wanted to buy, which are the wealthy middle class merchants that are growing. One example of these would be Vermeer. Now, this is Vermeer is we're also seeing the introduction of science in this. Many people believe that he used reflectory light, like he's basically making mirrors and optics to project the images he sees onto the canvas and then paint them. But again, everyday life. Rembrandt, again, this wealthy merchants. So here we have an example of the scientific revolution, in that Rembrandt's painting of Dr. Tulip in his anatomy lesson is where doctors are now dissecting bodies. And we see the introduction of scientific revolution into this part. And again, these are the wealthy merchants. So down in Italy, we see the Catholic Church is the main patron, and this is part of the Counter Reformation. In France, this is part of the absolute monarchs. For the Dutch, it's the wealthy patrons, the wealthy merchants that are doing this. So it fits into all these different areas. Here's the Night Watch, one of his most famous paintings. This is Rembrandt at 23. This is Rembrandt at 63. Again, painting of himself. Hall's normal everyday lives. The English Baroque, we're going to see Hogarth is one of the very first comic strip kind of writers, right? Drawers, and he does these engravings. Hogarth likes to point out the failures of the aristocracy, the upper nobility class. He also is very conservative as an urban population and wealthy merchant class, but even though he doesn't work himself, he's a kept man. You'll see that in one of the things we talk about. So here he is pointing out that from arranged marriage, the nobles, the families looking at their family trees, but notice these two have nothing. The married couple have no interest in each other. Here's the day after the wedding, and there's been this huge party, but she still have her kerchief on, and he's got one in his pocket. So who's he been with? It obviously wasn't his wife. And here he is with his pregnant teen bride or teen lover, and you can see the attitude towards doctors also Hogarth has, and see how he's commentating on that these people are pretending to be something. He's poking fun at the aristocracy, at the wealthy nobility, and that they're no better than any of us, that they, in many cases, they're even worse than any of us. Here they are at a party. He's flirting, she's flirting and paying no attention to each other. Here her husband's dying after catching her with her lover, who's sneaking out the window. And here her finding out that her lover has been executed and her husband has died, and now she's penniless because she has no money. It's either taking her rings off her finger, and they're taking her child away as she dies from heartbreak and poverty. And this was Hogarth's way of pointing out, like I said, the failures of the aristocracy, that these nobles think they're better than everyone. And that's that wealthy merchant class, again, thumbing their nose at society. So he's making fun of the upper class nobility, but he also makes fun of the lower classes, that gin was extremely cheap. And there are many cases where people were either dying or were so drug addicted from gin that literally they were dying of poverty and alcohol poisoning and child neglect and things. And so, but this was actually part of a story that wasn't true about a mother drinking gin and then smothering her child. But the commentary here is that the poor are so addicted to gin that they're selling all their goods and they're rioting in the streets and their city is falling apart and they're literally starving to death or killing their children for liquor, because he's making social commentary on poverty. But then the merchant class, this is beer, gin street and beer lane. Beer lane here, there's no one selling their goods. That's the pawn shop has gone out of business because nobody wants to sell their stuff. And here they're wealthy and they're prosperous and they're building. And so the hard-working, beer-drinking merchant class is doing well. And the poor, who are just drug-addled by gin, are a problem. And he did this as part of a support for a law that increased the taxes on gin, that he was the friend of the person who put this law into effect. And it's the middle class regulating the poor because it's a social commentary type of where you're policing poverty. It's like um well, be a good example would be the vagrancy laws that were created to basically keep homeless people or transients out of communities. This is the same thing he's doing. So he's speaking out against the lower class, and he's speaking out against the upper class. And this is an example of those wealthy merchants that Hogarth is, patron for. Gainsborough, again, here's Reynolds, we talked about. He's a portrait painter. These also transcend to what we call Rococo. This is the beginning of a Rococo art. We'll talk about next. Gainsborough, again, he thumbs his nose at the nobility because he loves to paint landscapes. Well, notice how they're kind of offset, because this painting literally goes this direction and shows their land. The wealthy landowners thought these were wonderful, and he's just wanting to paint landscapes and don't get paid for landscapes, so he's putting the portraits in there with it. Here's the Baroque furniture. This, again, the lavish lifestyle of the nobility and the wealthy merchant class. Baroque room. We're also going to see the introduction of music as strings and tonality, and the fact that nobility, in the case of monarchs, have enough money to pay people literally just to sit around and be artists, to be performers. And they have the money to throw parties and have these new concertos and things played for them. Monteverdi is one example of this. He's the beginning of the opera that we're going to see. We're also going to see Bach has that very much the emotional tone we talked about. And we see this idea of putting different stringed instruments together under Bach. And then, of course, Handel, his Messiah, the very much emotional power. And all these people are supported by the monarchs. In Handel's case, it was the English monarchs that were supporting him. And so this sets the stage for what's coming next with Mozart, where it's an introduction of the scientific revolution into it. All right. So that's all. Hope this helps you. But remember, Baroque art, it can be tied in as an example of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church trying to bring people in, the absolute monarchs trying to show how great they are, or the wealthy merchants showing how much wealthy they are and how they now have a part. So there you go.